My sister and I share a two-story house. It's a mother-daughter home, and there are two kitchens. My sister goes downstairs and I go upstairs. My sister is only sometimes at home since she frequently visits her boyfriend who lives 20 miles away. I'm 30, as I already stated. I shouldn't let being alone at home ever make me nervous, but it does. This occurred on a night when I was alone in my living room, watching a scary movie. My section of the house has an open floor plan, combining the living room, dining room, and kitchen into one ample space. My couch is in the center of the room, so when I watch TV, I have my back to a significant portion of the room behind me. So, it wouldn't be the most comfortable spot for folks who are easily frightened to sit alone and watch a horror movie. I'll admit that I found myself gazing over my shoulder a lot as I watched in the dark room with nothing but the light from the TV to cancel out the gloom. I want to think I'm not the only 30-year-old male who does this, but after the movie, I brushed my teeth, turned off all of the lights in the house, and went to bed. My nap lasted nearly 2 hours. I awoke about 1 a.m., not knowing why I had awoken. I then heard a voice from downstairs. It sounded like my sister, and she was inside the house, so it wasn't like she was yelling at me to open the door, but I recognized her voice. I had no idea what she was saying to me, but I was still exhausted and unable to think clearly. All I could think of was her calling for me or bickering with her partner. So I got out of bed and walked into the pitch-black corridor. I turned on the hallway lights and moved through the living room, where I heard my sister's voice from below. I could comprehend her saying my name now. In the dim light, I went downstairs, calling back at her. "What is it?" I checked the downstairs foyer for the light switch, but couldn't find it. When I say I felt tired as hell, I'm not lying. I strolled down the small corridor to her kitchen, found a light switch, and turned it on. The kitchen light illuminated her entire apartment, including her living room. The light was weak initially and took some time to brighten up, but no one was down there, not her or her partner. I went into her room, but it was deserted. I once called her name quite loudly. Nobody answered the phone, but immediately after I yelled, I heard something fall to the floor in my sister's bedroom, which I had just checked and found empty. I climbed the stairs like a young kid and returned to my room, where my phone sat. I tried calling her several times, but she has yet to answer. I was locked in my room, wondering whether I had hallucinated everything. I eventually fell asleep, and when I woke up the following day, I received a text from my sister questioning why I had contacted her at 1 a.m. I asked her if she was home last night, and she said no. She was at her boyfriend's house. I hurried downstairs to her bedroom to see what had fallen to the floor, but no object on the floor could have created that noise. Everything I heard that night was hallucinated, which is what I want to think, because the opposite would be far more terrifying. But I've never had any other hallucinations or sleep disturbances. So how vividly I heard my sister's voice and the sound in her room honestly creeps me out. My mom was unmarried for a significant amount of my childhood. She worked as an RN on a lousy RN schedule, and my brother went away to college, so I was left home alone a lot. My mother was working overnight on this particular night. It was a Sunday night, so I invited this girl, Molly, who I was talking to, over for a while. We watched a few movies and other things until she had to go home because her parents didn't like her staying out late. So, I was left to hold down the fort by myself. I visited to watch TV in my room while lying in bed. My bedroom is upstairs, adjacent to the backyard, so I could hear someone dragging one of the chairs on the deck outdoors. I stood up and peered out the window, noticing someone on one of the deck chairs below. I called Molly's name, thinking it was her. After all, she'd only been gone for about 10 minutes. But whoever it wasn't Molly who gazed up at me. I quickly moved away from the window to conceal. That wasn't somebody I recognized, at least not in the dim light. I texted a few close pals in our group chat to see if one of them was playing a joke on me. The ones that responded all replied no and inquired about what I was on about. I didn't think any of my buddies would come to my house to mess with me like that. I carefully moved back over to the window, scared as hell but still intrigued, and that figure was still sitting in the chair, looking up at my window. It was a guy, there was no doubt about it, and he spotted me. I hurried away from the window once more to turn off the television. I sat in bed curled up in a ball, arms wrapped around my knees. I waited in the dark for a time. I didn't want to turn on my phone's screen because I feared he'd see the light. I didn't want to move because the window was open and I was afraid he'd hear anything I did. I wanted him to think I had left the room. I had waited long enough. It must have been at least 5 minutes. I seriously doubted that the man outside was still alive. I eventually worked up the nerve to stand up and gaze out the window. When I noticed he was still down there, peering up at my window, a small part of me died within. Instead of fleeing through the window, I attempted to be brave and asked him, "What do you want?" I then noticed his shoulders moving up and down as if he was laughing loudly, but he didn't make any audible laughing sounds. Initially, I saw a faint whistling sound emanating from him. He appeared to be gasping from laughing so hard. I begged him to go and then went away from the window. I turned to my bed. For some reason, I was afraid to call the police. I left my room and listened at the top of the stairs. He was trying to get inside the house by pushing on the back door. I dashed back to my room to hide once more. I was 14. I was at a loss for what to do. I eventually heard the front door being fiddled with, as well as the man attempting to push the front door open. Thank God, he gave up immediately. My bedroom window and curtains were closed. I could have been killed simply if our doors hadn't been locked. When I was 14, I was small and weak and not a fighter. I didn't leave my room again that night until my mother arrived home about 9 o'clock. When I informed her what had happened, she was angry at me for not calling 911. Which in retrospect was quite stupid of me. One of many things I did, or instead didn't do at a young age, that I questioned tremendously. This was the story of how, as a young child at home alone, I almost died during one of the most intense nights of my life, with far too much going on. We have 5 children. I was 10, my older brother was 14, and my younger sister was 5. It was a Friday evening. My brother was out with his friends, clearly causing trouble, when my parents received the dreaded phone call. I was playing a Star Wars video game in my room when I heard my mother start freaking out and crying. I became terrified and rushed to see what was wrong. My mother was on the phone with a hospital, who had called to tell my parents that a car had hit my brother. We were all shaken and terrified. My brother's leg had been broken, but I'm unsure what else was said over the phone. All I remember is my parents rushing to put on their coats, dragging my little sister from her room, and asking me if I could stay home alone. When I said yes, they dashed to their car and drove away. Of course, I was worried about my brother, but I didn't want to go to the hospital and see him in distress. My parents didn't want me or my sister to go, but they didn't want to leave my 5-year-old sister at home alone. It's worth noting that my brother recovered well, as his injury is no longer relevant to the story, other than the fact that it was the reason I was left home alone on a Friday night. Before my father left, he tried to reassure my mother that he would be fine. So, seeing my father in that state made me feel better. I felt my mother was being dramatic, as any mother would be. I had been playing the Star Wars game for a few hours when I heard the front door open. By this time, I had closed my bedroom door. It was well past midnight and bedtime, so I switched off the TV and PlayStation and crawled into my bed with my Game Boy. I tried to listen to hear my parents' voices, perhaps to see if my brother was with them, or to listen to what they were saying, but I couldn't hear anything. I felt something was wrong after a few minutes of not hearing them, even coming up the stairs. I walked over to the ledge and railing overlooking the living room and quietly opened my door. The lights were turned off, but 3 tall people stood in my living room. They weren't my relatives. I was so terrified that I froze for a split second before walking back into my room and closing the door as quietly as possible. But I knew it wasn't quite enough. They had to have heard the door click shut, even if only slightly. I dashed to my closet, quietly opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it. I was sitting behind a slew of boxes and bags of clothes crammed into my wardrobe. I was well hidden from view. I remember waiting for my bedroom door to open for what seemed like an eternity, and when it did, I knew I would die. I heard footsteps enter the room. I couldn't tell how many people there were. It could have been one or two. The footsteps moved to my bed, and I heard my covers manipulated, followed by silence. Then, there were more footsteps toward the closet door, followed by silence for a few seconds before the closet door opened. By this point, my heart was in my throat. I did nothing but sit quietly and hold my breath. The door had been open for a long time, but I didn't look up or move. It had to be at least 20 seconds before the door closed again. Footsteps were heard walking away from the door and out of the room. I finally looked up and realized I was visible to that person from where I was crouched down behind the bags and boxes. It was probably an hour before I heard my parents return. I dashed downstairs to meet them. The intruders had left the front door ajar and stolen several valuables from our home. For our family, the night just got worse and worse. My parents were so hurried to get to the hospital that they didn't lock the door. I was fortunate not to have been killed or kidnapped. I now wonder if the person who opened the closet and stood there for 20 seconds noticed me hiding there. Maybe he was just a robber who came to rob a house rather than kidnap or harm a child. Or perhaps he didn't see me, and I narrowly avoided death or injury. As a teenager, I was home alone for a week while living with my parents, which was rare because my parents didn't go out much. Patty, my mother's wealthy friend, invited my parents on a trip she was paying for. Because I am an only child, I was left alone in the house. We lived in Licking County, Ohio. In Newark, yes, our county was called Licking County. My parents' old house had woods in the backyard and was on a quiet road with only a few cars passing each day. We usually had a large deck in the backyard overlooking the woods and a reasonably sized backyard. We even had a small fish pond and an above-ground pool. This happened on a Thursday night. I remember it because I had conversations with friends about weekend plans that day. This occurred in July of 2013. When it started, I was out on the deck smoking weed and listening to music through my speaker. I thought I heard a voice coming from the woods. I turned down the music and listened for a few moments. I raised it again because it did not repeat. When the music became louder, I heard a voice from the woods again. I turned off the music entirely this time and listened for extended periods. Another voice was calling from the woods, confirming that I wasn't hallucinating. A male's voice saying, "Hey, over here." He was a little distant, but not too far away. The woods were about 20 to 30 yards from the deck, and that's where the voice came from. I didn't think it was someone calling out for me in a million years, but rather some kids playing manhunt. "Hey, over here. We need help," the voice said again. This time, I realized the voice was too deep to be a child, and when a voice yells out, "We need help," it's always a little unsettling. I was starting to feel uneasy because I wondered if these yells were directed at me. Now I heard a voice yell, "Straight in front of you. Please come help us." The voice was coming from the woods directly in front of me. This was aimed at me. "Who is that?" I asked hesitantly, and they replied, "We just need help. We're stuck in the woods." "What does that mean?" I inquired. The voice responded, "Just please come help right before you." I rose from my seat, walked down the deck steps onto the grass and into the woods. I exclaimed, "I'll be there." "Where have you gone?" "Right in front of you. I see you," the voice said instantly. "Wait, are you alone or with someone?" I asked back. This time, there was yet to be a response. I stopped about halfway towards the woods. I felt terrible. I began walking backward towards the house and the deck. I didn't want to turn my back on the woods because it had taken me so long to realize something fishy was happening. I returned to the deck, and the voice said nothing else. If they saw me and this was real, they would have asked, at the very least, "Where are you going?" They knew I was on to something, but who knows how many people were in there. It could have been 1, 2, or 3. Getting lost in the woods makes no sense, especially since he or they could see me. For example, how did their shirt get caught on a branch? To be safe, I went inside and locked all of the doors. I sat in my living room for a while, still high, and that's why I was more trusting at first, because I was tall and relaxed. Then I heard the voice again from outside, this time closer and definitely in the backyard rather than the woods. I heard water splashing. It could have been the pool or the pond. I dashed to the window to check it out. I didn't see anyone at first, but then a voice called out with a laugh, "I see you." I noticed him. There was only one guy visible. He was hidden behind the pool on the other side, and all I could see was his head. It was simply too dark to see anything other than his dark, medium-length hair. I shut the blinds and tried to ignore it, hoping he would lose interest if he saw I wasn't entertaining him. I didn't want to give him what he wanted because he was probably a sick, deranged person who enjoyed messing with people. But my limit was reached when there was a terrible, aggressive banging on the window where I had just closed the blinds, and the guy on the other side was screaming, "Help!" I yelled at the top of my lungs, "You are insane. The cops are on their way." I screamed it several times, trying to sound crazier than him. On the other side of the glass, I heard him laugh. His laughter began to fade as I assumed he walked away. I sat on the couch again, trembling, shaking, and out of breath. I sat there for a while, and the guy appeared to have given up. I still slept well that night because weed helps me sleep, but I wonder if I would have handled that situation differently if I hadn't been high. The case made me more wary of who I let into my house,